Some people, no matter how hard they work, will never truly be given.
I think pastors are some of the most gifted people in the world, but they don't believe in themselves. All they've ever done is pastoring, and they're scared. They're scared to take a leap of faith. They're scared to take a risk and leave all that's comfortable.
Welcome to the Vanderbloemen Leadership Podcast, where we talk about how to build, run, and keep a great team. I'm your host, Holly Tate, and on today's podcast, William talks with Shawn Lovejoy, a pastor, a coach, and an author. You can follow Shawn at couragetolead.com. He was the founding pastor of Mountain Lake Church in Cumming, Georgia, as well as the founder of churchplanners.com and the Velocity Conference. In today's episode, William and Shawn talk about transitioning well. Be sure to tweet your takeaways with us using the hashtag Vandercast. That's hashtag Vandercast. Let's jump in.
Well, Shawn, thanks so much for joining us today. Always glad to have guests on the show that let our audience into the life of pastors, and just really thrilled to have known you for so long and have you here to share with our folks today.
Thanks, man. I feel the same way. Honored to be your friend and partner in so many ways.
Yeah. So folks may not know, people probably know you planted Mountain Lake Church, you started churchplanners.com, but you've recently gone through kind of a transition where you're in a new season of life. Why don't you just catch everybody up with where you are and what that's been like?
Yeah, well, for those familiar with my ministry, some not, 16 years, I had my cake and eat it too. I pastored Mountain Lake Church, the Little C Church. Then we launched churchplanners.com, the Big C Church. And so I got to pastor a local congregation, and then I got to pastor and coach pastors, all over the world. Churchplanners.com wasn't necessarily, started to launch churches. All the networks and denominations do that, but these pastors, realized they plan 18 months to launch in terms of planting the church, and then Sunday comes every 7 days, and there's no one left to help them talk through the complexities of those issues. So that's what churchplanners.com was about. And just over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been this supernatural tugging on my life and my heart toward one of those two C's, the little C or the big C. And after a lot of prayer and consideration, I just felt called to this, to coach pastors full time with my life. Thus, couragetolead.com. But of course, the backside of that, where your path and my path intersected once again, I'm like, oh no, but I have this 16-year-old teenage church. This mega church with multiple campuses. The last thing I'd want to do is pursue God's new vision for my life at the neglect of the local church, and what's going to happen to Mountain Lake and all of that. And so thank God for our friendship and our journeys there. And I'm just proud of what God's done. I'm most proud out of all the things I've done the last 16 years of the way I left. That's what I'm most proud of.
Hey, that's a good point to dive into a little bit. I tell people frequently, people will remember how you leave longer than they will, long after they've forgotten what you did while you were there.
I agree.
And so tell me lessons you saw on the way out, some things you thought you did well, some things you go, oh man, I wish pastors would know this as they're thinking of transitioning.
Well, I believe this about everybody. I mean, I'll say this to every team member out there. I think the way you leave reveals your character. That's the truth of the matter. The way you leave reveals your character. That being said, I had to live that, and how hard it is when God places a new vision on your heart and your life, but for you to stay where you are and sit in the saddle and finish well and hand it off stronger and better than, where it is presently, and hand it off to your successor and at its high point. All of that takes a lot of resolve and a lot of character, to do that. Because frankly, once God speaks to you, your heart and brain immediately shifts somewhere else. So the hardest part of this was sitting in the saddle, finishing well, even continuing to take Mountain Lake to a higher point after I announced our congregation that I was going to be leaving. And that, it's a lot of hard work, frankly.
Yeah, totally. And so there are probably a lot of pastors out there today, they're struggling. I know I tell guys, if you're feeling a call somewhere else, a couple of pointers. One, if you're feeling restless, like your time might be over. One, if it's Monday, wait till Tuesday. Don't quit on
Right.
Monday. If I had a nickel for every resume that came in on a Monday, I could retire. But
Always gets better on Tuesday.
it usually does. And then the second thing I'll tell people is, if you stay in prayer about this, and if there continues to be a restlessness, then it may be that God's exploring in your heart where your next chapter is. And the minute you feel called somewhere else, you are no longer called where you were. God can't call a person two places at once. He just doesn't work that way. So I think guys feel a little bit guilty, like they're, I don't know, fooling around on their family or something, if they're thinking about other opportunities. But Jesus got in trouble all the time because he wouldn't stay in one village. And Paul stayed in Ephesus about 3 years, and that was it. He kind of moved around from place to place as well. So when you started to feel that wrestling, how'd you process it and say, is this a bad burrito from last night? Is it the nasty email I got from somebody that didn't deserve? Or is this a call of God? How'd you tease through all that in your soul?
Well, one, just let's think through the filter of a founding pastor of a mega church. I've been telling a lot of pastors lately in my, consulting and counseling and coaching with them, pastors get a bad rap for leaving too quickly. But I also think just as many pastors, if not more, stay too long. They stay too long. And I told our church, I said, this is hard. This is hard for me and it's hard for you, but it won't be easier on you 10 years from now. Because the church is going to get built more around my personality. That's going to be the great tendency. And, then I'm going to be old, and then you're going to want to hire somebody young, half my age, and the old people aren't going to like him, and they're going to leave, and they're the tithers, and that's how churches are blowing up. So, because nobody's planning for this stuff. So I think, sometimes we need to think through, how long is too long here? What does that look like for me? And we won't quote names, but there are a lot of guys, I think, in huge churches staying too long at the default of their, at the neglect of, what's best for the church. But then secondly, I just think it's realizing that the church is a sacred stewardship. And even when God does call us, like it's our responsibility, I think we're going to be held accountable to God, how we hand, the baton off. And it should be on a high note, not a low note with our tail between our legs. Even if we haven't been knocking out of the park, the moment we decide God's calling us somewhere else, man, it ought to give us a new resolve. I'm going to make it better. I'm going to handle issues, personnel issues, financial issues, budget issues, character issues, conflict issues in the church, everything I can to set it up in a healthy way for my successor. And I just felt like I was going to be held accountable to God for that. And so we went after it, man. The good news is once you're leaving, you don't care about getting fired anymore. So, so you can make decisions without fear of man. And it was actually a freeing place to be, the last year.
Well, and you and I mean, you let me into a pretty holy ground and kind of processed this with me for a long time before the decision was really made. Tell me when that first unsettling in your heart started that God does anytime he calls somebody somewhere. When that first started, what did that feel like, and how did you and Tricia process that?
Well, you do feel guilty. You do feel guilty. And you feel like, especially as a founding pastor, you feel like, I'm going to let this church down if I go and do something else. But I felt like Jesus said to me, when he said, I will build my church, he actually wasn't talking about Mount Lake Church. As much as I'd like to think that, he was talking about the Big C Church. And when I began to feel that unsettling that God might call me somewhere else, it gave me a new confidence, a new courage, a new peace to know, hey, you know what? Regardless of what happens to Mount Lake Church, I'm going to do everything I can to set it up for the future. But Jesus said, I'll build my church, and that's people. And there's nothing the evil one can do to snatch that away. 16 years of life change, and so I began to realize this is just bigger than Mountain Lake. This is about the church, and Jesus is going to build his church. And even though I was sick at my stomach and thinking about, handing it off to someone else, I realized, man, Jesus is bigger than this, and it's his church. It's not my church. It doesn't belong to me. And so that helped me process through, the difficulty. At the end of the day, for me, William, it came back to passion. I recognized that God was shifting some passions in my own heart and in my own life. And sometimes you just need to recognize passions change. It's okay. Most of us as pastors, we were in youth ministry at some point, and thank God my passion changed.
Students across
student ministry.
Students across America are thanking God that passion changed for you and me both.
Exactly right. I was an awful student pastor my last couple of years because my passion changed. And I think sometimes we get to the end of the food chain and we become CEO or we become senior pastor, and we think that shouldn't happen to us. But I do think it does. And I think there are seasons and there are spans, and then God reshifts and remolds your heart. And I think if I had stayed in a great church, in a great situation, we had a healthy staff, healthy culture, there's no reason to leave. But if I had stayed while my passions had shifted and changed, I think I would have slowly died on the inside.
Wow.
And I think it happens to a lot of guys, unbeknownst to them, sneaks up on you.
Well, and a lot of guys, I think, that I interview and talk to, it's not just that the passion changed, but the options die. Like, as you get older as a pastor, what are you going to go do if you're not doing this? What do not everybody's got a ton of options. And I'll never forget, I've said this before on this podcast, John Maxwell, who I had the honor of being mentored by him as a young guy, and still do, but when I was a young pastor, I said to him, John, what should I be doing right now? What's the most important thing right now as a young pastor? And he said, William, wise young leaders spend their early years creating options for their later years. I thought, wow. So if you're younger and you're in your spot where you're feeling all good, that's great. But you should be creating some options so that if you do need to walk away, if you're no longer the right guy for your church, you have the ability to do that. Some of y'all that are listening today need to hear that and say, it's time to get out of debt. It's time to get my financial life in order so that if I had to walk away, I could. Others, it's just blowing your mind out and thinking a little bit farther. I mean, Shawn, we had the privilege of helping Mountain Lake find Shawn's successor, for those of you listening. And I can't tell you the number of people that asked me a question. You said, okay, I've heard all that there is. I've heard the story, but hey, man, Shawn's in his 40s. The church is growing. What in the world is he a felon now? Did he, like, what really happened? I'm like, no, really, unless he's fooling me too. He really just felt a call of God. And Shawn, is it safe to say that over that, you processed this for like a year before it really got real?
Probably 5 years. Probably 5 years. I talked to my wife about it at least 5 years ago the first time, so it's been a long time, coming. And I think you're right. Unbeknownst to me, churchplanners.com, 13, 14 years ago when it started developing an option. And I could see it. I could see out there, the potential of that. And I think a lot of pastors get trapped. We overpay ourselves often. We don't think outside our little ivory tower. And I think a lot of pastors are trapped. And I would just say to this, I think pastors are some of the most gifted people in the world, but they don't believe in themselves. All they've ever done is pastoring, and they're scared. They're scared to take a leap of faith. They're scared to take a risk and leave all that's comfortable, and what they know and the familiar, and to a fault. And we end up, our passions die, and there's a lot of unhappy pastors and all of that out there. So that's my, stump I'm standing on these days and preaching on to pastors is, hey, have a plan. And your book talks about it. We shouldn't wait till we're 70 to be thinking about that plan either.
Mm-hmm. And is it fair to say that over the course of that 5 years, God got louder with his call with you away from where you were?
Yeah, I do think it's one of those things where, you say, well, is it something I ate? Am I upset? Am I just discontent? First time I talked to my wife about it, she goes, you just need to be happy where you are, be content and all of that. And I said, okay, I hear you, babe. I'd go back in there again, but it keeps coming back, about every 6 months, it just kept on coming back. And I would say to guys who are there, and it just keeps coming back around, man, it could be you, but it just might be the Holy Spirit. And Henry Cloud says in Necessary Endings, it takes a healthy, self-aware, emotionally, spiritually, aware leader to say, you know what, I've done all I think I want to do, and maybe all I can do here, and it's time for change for the kingdom and for what God's gifted me and wired me, to do uniquely. And I'd love to think I did it because I'm healthy and because the ministry was healthy and because I believe both could be healthier. And that's when you got the kingdom's purposes in mind, and it's not just what's best for you.
Wow.
It's a win-win-win-win.
Hey, take just a minute when you talk about that ending. I got to watch how God called Chris Emmett to be the next pastor at Mountain Lake Church. But then you guys did a pretty masterful job of it's almost like he went through Rush with your church in getting introduced to him. And I'd love for our listeners to hear, what was the plan behind that? How did y'all pull off founding pastors leading in his prime, here's the new guy, and make that a smooth transition? Walk us through that a little bit.
Well, I would just say to leaders, first of all, I recognize because things weren't, wiry and messy in our church, the church supported me. They loved me. They trusted me as a leader. And I think leaders sometimes discount the credibility they have and therefore the right to lead in their church, even as they're exiting. And so, I was able to talk through, and I had some leverage because I started the church, but also founding senior pastor. I wanted to play the primary role in selecting my successor. I think that is key. Can't skip over that. In talking with several, megachurch pastors that have done successions, everyone I've talked to that where it didn't go well, they said, I wish I would have, pounded on the table a little bit more for a louder voice in selecting my successor. Because one, like the church trust factor just goes way up. The fact that I was ratifying this guy, and when it was said at the end of the day, I was able to put my arm around him on our stage and say, I feel like this is God's man and woman to lead this church, and I'm asking you to follow them as they follow Jesus. I think a lot of pastors underestimate the power of that simple step. And I know polity and a lot of churches won't allow for that. I'm not necessarily talking about polity. Leadership is influence. I'm just saying to ask for the right to be part of the process and ratify, that person that's taken your place if it's at all possible. And then, like you say, we call it Hell Week or Marathon Week, where we took an entire week, 7 days, and man, we introduced, Chris and Brianna to probably 1,500 people in small circles and rows before he ever got on the stage, one time. And, then Chris did a great job just coming in and loving people, not turning things upside down, but earning the right to lead, which is a lot of what I talked to him about. And then when you've earned that relational equity, make those changes. And it's just, and he and I talk every week. He called me this morning. We have a set Wednesday morning every week. And he calls me and I ask him some questions. He asks me some questions. I'm coaching him behind the scenes, so he looks like a genius. He is a genius. He's smarter than me. But it's been an amazing, process. But it was hard. It was hard to finish well. It was hard to work that process out, over 6 months with our leaders, with our church, with my successor, with our pastors who are going to be on the team. There's a lot of work. I was tired when I got done, but it was worth it. It was worth it. And it's fulfilling now to see the fruit of awesome. That labor.
One of the big takeaways that we saw in your transition with Chris was this week where he met 1,500 people before preaching that weekend, and everybody knew he was coming, and there wasn't really like a congregational vote coming up. So this is going to be the guy. But we wanted to make sure that when he got up on the platform and started to speak, he didn't just have to give a sugar stick message from some conference talk that he's done, but could just preach. And I was reminded during your strategy you implemented there of a line one of my preaching professors told me years and years ago, and they said, and I don't know that's always true, but I think it holds true most of the time. He said, people will not learn from someone they do not like.
I agree.
And it's almost like, you establish relationship before you give data download. You guys let him meet and greet 1,500 people. And the smartest thing you did, by the way, is have Brianna in that, because people like her a lot more than they like him unless they're dumb.
Absolutely.
Let them like him first and then learn from him. And if you're a new pastor going into a situation, man, it's not always true, but people will not learn from someone they do not like. I mean, that's gold. I wish I'd have listened to that more early in my ministry.
I think there's a big difference when that new leader stands up on the stage the first day between, I don't know you, impress me, or I've met you, I like you, I'm rooting for you today and praying for you today. And I'm so proud of the fact we were able, before he took the stage the first time, we had half our church saying, I like you, you've hugged my neck, you and your wife both, we're rooting for you today. We're praying for you today. I'm talking about his first message. You know what I'm saying? To be able to have that kind of equity when you take the stage at the first time, like I mean it. Like I'm proud of that because I think we honored the Lord, man. In handing off this thing in a healthy way. He will tell you, he lost his voice that week. He'd said the same thing so many times. It wore both of us out to a frazzle physically and emotionally. But you know what? It was worth it. The fruit of it all is worth it. So
that's awesome. Well, guys don't get to hear that kind of thing in ministry very often. And the other thing that's exciting about your new call, I love talking about this ending and transition, but I want people to hear about what you're doing now. I joke all the time that when we get called in to do a staff search, before you know it, we're hearing about pastors' lives. We're hearing about their heartaches. We're hearing about everything. And the line we say around here all the time is, if this search thing ever dries up, we're going to open a counseling firm for pastors because they don't have anywhere to go. And part of what God's called you to is to provide kind of a safe harbor for them. Is that a fair assessment? Tell us about that.
I think you and I both know you already have a counseling ministry because that's what you end up doing. And the tragedy of it all, and I learned this through churchplanners.com, there are very few places that pastors feel like they can go to talk through really what's keeping them up at night. And even like mega church pastors that you want to reach out to and get their counsel, they're often so busy and so overwhelmed and so overextended, and they're leading their own mega ministries and networks and all, just there aren't many places to go. And so I had 2 or 3, 4 or 5 men, in the last 16 years that have been more available and more accessible to me that I can, pick up the phone and call and say, I've got this specific contextual issue. I've got this guy. I've got this worship leader. It's always a worship leader, right? Or I've got this, I've got this guy in my church, or I've got this situation, or we've got this financial deal, or we've got this huge financial opportunity coming up. Who do you talk through that stuff with and get wise counsel? And pastors get isolated. They make mistakes out there on an island. And my heart and desire is just coaching these pastors and their teams and their leaders through these specific issues that keep them up at night. I feel like God's given me some measure of wisdom. This, I'm an Alabama fan. That's where I grew up. And Nick Saban was a pretty good coach, a pretty good player, but he's an awesome coach. He played football at Kent State. He was an average player. And I think I was a above average, senior pastor. But I feel like God's gifted me for my highest, best use to coach pastors. And so I plan to do that with 10,000 pastors over the next 10 years. That's my heart, man.
That's awesome. And if you're listening today, Holly will be sending links to couragetolead.com. But then she'll send you a lot of things and resources that'll help you get in touch with Shawn if need be. But that sounds great. And I think you're going to look back one day and say, remember when we thought it was just going to be 10,000? So that's awesome.
Well, I pray that. So I don't know if I can think bigger than that, but thank goodness he can.
That's right.
I'm thankful to you. Thanks for being part of the journey. And I love you and I appreciate you. And you've been a counselor to me. So I'm thankful.
You're very kind and a very good friend. I don't have many clients that I've done P90X with, but
that's another podcast.
That's right. Hey, we like to close our time out with a few set questions just to hear what's going on in your life. Tell me a book you're reading that's really got your soul quickened. You're really making you think differently, and you can't say the Bible.
My pastor and friend Chris Hodges told me about a brand new book this week. Many might be familiar with, maybe not, called Intentional Living by John Maxwell. Wow. I'm in chapter 1. Just finished chapter 1. Fantastic book. I think it's the best book he's written in years. He just talks about, living a life of significance. The other thing I'm reading, the best book I read this past year was Sam Chan's Leadership Pain. Oh, wow. Great book.
Wow.
In which he says, you'll never grow beyond the threshold of your own pain.
That's
so
awesome.
Those have been great books for me just recently.
Cool. How about what's an app that's got your attention right now? It doesn't have to be business or productivity. Where's your phone headed these days?
Let's see. I don't know if I do anything sexy with my apps. Let's see if I do anything.
I hope not. We had that.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to look and see what I've got here. Hey, Guitar Hero Live rocks. Guitar Hero Live. There's no charge for that. Is a great app.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And so, last question. Tell us a time from the Shawn Lovejoy blooper reel where you were up on stage and it just kind of didn't go according to plan. We've heard some great stories of people kind of messing up, and it really, frankly, it encourages all the rest of us to realize, okay, everyone's human.
Well, I mean, I've done things I did was just decide spontaneously to have open mic in the congregation. And, it went really, it was good for about 7 minutes. The last 3 minutes really, really tanked. And a lady grabbed the mic and confessed to being assaulted on our church campus several years previously in front of the whole church.
No.
Yes. While she's holding the mic. And Blake Stanley was standing there with the mic in hand, and he just froze, deer in the headlights. And I didn't even understand clearly what she was saying. I couldn't even hear her that well. And so I said to her, well, God forgives you, you forgive yourself, and we'll pray for you. And she sat down.
Wow.
It was awful. It was awful. So, but God helped us shepherd that family through some difficult stuff in the weeks, fall. But we laugh about that now. Lesson learned. No, don't do open mic, guys. Don't do open mic.
Not so much. I don't see Jesus doing a lot of that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Shawn, thanks so much for joining us. And everybody who's tuning in, thanks so much for continuing to tune in. Hashtag Vandercast. You never know what's going to happen when you use that hashtag. Sometimes we drop happy things in the mail. Join us again next week for another podcast on how you can learn to build and run and keep a great team.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. You can connect with us on Twitter at Vanderbloemen SG and hashtag your key takeaways with hashtag Vandercast. You can also receive more information about what we do here at Vanderbloemen Search Group and notes from today's podcast at vanderbloemen.com/podcast. See you next time.